Hey guys, my name is Nathan and welcome to Q&A, where we're answering your questions about the Bible, the church, and anything else that you want to know. Let's look at today's question. How should I talk with a non-Christian who thinks that I'm doing wrong? And this is the final part of a 4-part series we've been working on over the last month. As you may remember, in week 1 we discussed, how should I talk with a Christian who I think is doing wrong? Then in week 2 we asked, how should I talk with a non-Christian who I think is doing wrong? And then in week 3 we flipped the script from when we thought they were doing wrong to they thought we were doing wrong. And we covered, well, how should I talk with a Christian who thinks that I'm doing wrong? And that leads us to this week, our final week, where we're going to ask, how should I talk with a non-Christian who thinks I'm doing wrong? Because really, communication is so important, especially in touchy subjects like approaching someone who we think has done wrong. So we need to be able to make sure to cover each area thoroughly. And this week's question is probably the trickiest out of all of the questions that we've asked. And the reason is, if it's a Christian, we have a common base from which to judge our morality on. We have the Bible to help us differentiate right from wrong. As Jesus said in John 14, if you love me, you'll obey my commandments. So we as Christians hold God and therefore the Bible as the ultimate authority. And therefore, if the Bible speaks on it, the matter's decided. And if the Bible doesn't, then it moves to being an opinion and is therefore between a person and God. So Christians have the Bible as an agreed upon moral foundation. But the issue we run into is non-Christians do not have an agreed upon moral foundation. And real quick, I need to make a caveat here. When I'm speaking of non-Christians, I'm speaking of people who are not also in another religion. Because studies show that 75% of Americans who say they are not Christians also say they are non-religious in any way. So if you're talking to someone who is not a Christian in America, odds are high that they have no religious affiliation or belief. Now, what non-religious people do agree on is something called moral relativism. And I know moral relativism, you're like, oh no, big seminary words. But really, you guys all know exactly what this is. It's summarized in this phrase. Everyone should decide what is right and wrong for themselves. Or everyone's truth is equal. And that's an age-old idea. It goes all the way back to Judges 17, where in those days, Israel had no king. And king in this case means God. So in those days, Israel had no God, and all the people just did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. And we can easily tie that into today, because a study in October of 2019 asked Americans to give their opinion on this statement. Whatever is right for your life is the only truth you can know. And 60% of all Americans agreed with that statement. And further, 74%, 3 out of every 4 people under the age of 40, said they believe there is no absolute right or wrong, that you need to do whatever is right in your own eyes. And that creates a huge complication when a moral relativist approaches you telling you that you've done wrong. But it also offers us a huge opportunity, an opportunity to engage them with the gospel. So let's say they approach you and you're like, oh man, I was doing wrong. The first step you're going to want to do is you're going to want to hear them out. That's the same as last week, that you make sure that you listen to all they have to say, you ask questions that you need clarification on, and you don't take a defensive posture. But the second step is where things really start to change. Because in the second step, you fess up and you get the opportunity to discuss God's grace. Because yeah, you have been caught red-handed. You're a complete and total hypocrite. You've said you're a Christian, and now they have caught you doing something that goes completely against what the Bible says. So what better time to fess up and use that opportunity to discuss the blessings of redemption and the grace of God? Because the message of the gospel is the good news of God's grace for us. That He sent Jesus to die on the cross for our salvation, for us as sinners, even though we absolutely do not deserve it. Romans 3:10 says it this way, that no one is righteous, not a single person. So apologize that you haven't always been the best example of how to follow Christ. But then explain that even though you have messed up, God didn't leave you. Christ still died for you, and God still loves you. And you know, not only did you mess up, you're going to mess up again. But fortunately, God's love isn't dependent on how good you can be. Ephesians 2:8 says it this way, that God saved you by His grace when you believed. And you don't get to take credit for this. It is a free gift from God. And that is something we can have confidence in. That God still loves us and that grace is a free gift, not a reward for how good we are or how good we can be. I mean, what a great message of hope to be able to give to someone. And that brings us to our third step. Tell them what you've done and what you plan on doing about it. Don't use grace to excuse your sin. Go ahead and own it. Tell them what you plan on doing about it. Because you need to let them know that you take your sin seriously and that you'll be working on it. But ultimately, you know that God still loves you. And with that, you've turned your mistake into an amazing opportunity to sow the seeds of grace into someone's life and into their mind. Okay, so that's how you handle it if someone comes up to you to talk to you and you realize what you did was wrong. But the conversation becomes a lot tougher if you don't think what you did was wrong. You feel like their thoughts on what you did wrong was probably just their opinions. Now, once again, the first step is still the same, that you're going to want to hear them out. You're going to listen to all they have to say. You're going to ask any questions you need clarification on. But again, this is where the second step deviates dramatically. Because in the second step, you're going to want to discuss the question of moral relativism. You're going to want to ask them, how do they know that you did something wrong? And this is where the issue of moral relativism runs into its problem. Because a moral relativist should really never tell you that you're doing something wrong. I mean, after all, their belief is whatever is right for you is the truth. And that means there can be no wrong. Everyone is right in their own eyes. You see, just like we have to hold close to our beliefs in the Bible, a moral relativist has to hold close to their belief, which is no matter what, everyone's truth of right and wrong is up to them. And I get it. Some of you guys are going to have an issue with this because you're thinking, but that can't be. I mean, there are certain things that cross a boundary. They're absolute, like murder. But that's because a lot of moral relativists want to have their cake and eat it too. They both want there to be some moral things that are absolute right and wrong. No murder, no raping, no bigotry of any kind, etc. But that undermines the single core tenet of moral relativism. Because a moral relativist has to believe that all right and wrong, all truth is up to each individual, no matter what. I mean, the whole belief system is based on no one being able to tell anyone else what is right and wrong. So if someone comes up to you and points out that you've done wrong, it's the perfect opportunity to satisfy some curiosity, to ask them, but how do you know that? Like, how do you know that I'm doing wrong? And they might say something like, well, your actions hurt this person. But then again, still, how do you know that that's wrong if it's right for me? And they might say, well, hurting people is always wrong. But is it? How do you know that? I mean, is there any conceivable scenario where hurting someone would be okay? And how do you start to determine those things? And this is again where I need to add another caveat, because you cannot be rude about this. If you come in as arrogant or pedantic or demeaning of their beliefs, this thing is going to blow up in your face real fast. But in reality, you have to know the answer to this question. You have to be able to dig into the foundation of their moral framework, because you need to know the answer of what do they really believe? And if they can't figure out what they believe, how can they tell you what's right and wrong? Which means if you ask someone who believes in moral relativism, and again, this is 60% of Americans and 75% of every single person under the age of 40. If you ask them questions about how they know you did wrong, eventually one of two things has to happen. Either, option number one, they stick with moral relativism, which means they're going to have to give up their accusation on you and say that they can't tell you what they did was wrong. Because if they want to stick with moral relativism, they have to take the stance that what you did was right in your own eyes. It was okay. Or option number two, they're going to have to give up their belief in moral relativism and say that they believe there are some things that are absolutely right and absolutely wrong. And if option two is the case, it opens up this wonderful conversation about, okay, then how do we determine what things are always good and always bad? Which means we get to make a proposal. That if we agree there must be some absolute goods and bads, then there must be a way of measuring those absolute goods and bads. We have to have a moral foundation. And we can propose the idea that that moral foundation has to be God. 1 Corinthians 3 says it this way, that no one can lay any foundation other than the one we already have in Jesus Christ. We can't really have the conversation about right and wrong, about good and bad, without having a foundation from which we can all agree, a foundation to measure that. And the foundation has to be God. Christian speaker Ravi Zacharias ran into this same issue in one of his sermons when a moral relativist wanted to discuss good and evil without using God as the foundation. And here's how he responded.
And I remember years ago at the University of Nottingham, when I'd finished a talk, when a person stood up, or a student stood up and shouted from the floor, and he said, there's too much of evil in this world, there can't be a God. There's too much of evil and suffering in this world. But this Englishman raised it, and I said to him, why don't I make it clear first why you are asking this question and what your assumptions are. I said, when you say there's evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? He paused and he said, yes. I said, when you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil? He struggled with this and we interacted, and finally he said, yeah, there would have to be an objective moral standard from which to differentiate between good and evil. I said, when you say there's a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver, but that's whom you're trying to disprove and not prove, because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is your question? And he looked at me, paused, and he said, "What then am I asking you?" Now, this was years ago. I said, "I know what you're asking me, and I'm not trying to make it hard for you." It's an existentially felt question that often doesn't examine the logical presuppositions within this. God has to remain in the paradigm for the question to be real, and therefore the answer has to come from what God's purposes and God's description.
I love that story. And I know it sounds complex, but it actually breaks down the need of God very quickly and very simply. Because without an ultimate authority, without God, we can't even ask the question what is good and what is bad. We have no foundation from which to begin. Which brings us back to our question. How should I talk with a non-Christian who thinks I'm doing wrong? Well, if you did wrong, it's a wonderful chance to talk about the gospel, to tell them about God's grace. And if you didn't do wrong, you also have a wonderful chance to talk about the gospel. But you get to talk about the contradictory nature of moral relativism, and that to have a foundation for right and wrong, you need a moral lawgiver. You need God, who is the foundation of truth. John 8 says it this way, that Jesus said to the people who believed in him, "You are truly my disciples if you remain faithful to my teachings. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." You see, either way, God has given each of us an opportunity to engage someone with the gospel. So use that opportunity to let them know the truth and pray that the truth will set them free.